Hey guys, what's going on? I'm Lufa. So there's been a really exciting development for fans of The Office, and that is that a reboot is officially in the works. This news was actually announced in light of the writer's strike finally coming to an end, because now that the writers have reached an agreement, producers are free to start working on new projects again, with The Office reboot being one of them. When it comes to the details, there's not much we know besides the biggest piece of information, which is that Greg Daniels, the creator of the original US adaptation, will be involved. However, outside of that, little is known, and although there's been lots of rumors, we really have no idea which direction this reboot is going to take. So today I wanted to give my thoughts on the possible directions that the show might go and discuss if I think a reboot of The Office can ultimately work. Because despite a reboot sounding simple enough, it actually gets pretty complicated when you look at the many different ways that this show could end up being produced. Surprisingly enough, there are 5, at least that I've thought of. And in this video, we're going to discuss the potential benefits and disadvantages of each one. To make the possibilities more organized, I've split them into 2 routes. The first route assumes that the show will use a majority of the old cast, while the second route assumes that the show will reboot with a new cast. Both of these routes still have multiple ways they can go, and we're going to go over the pros and cons of each possible scenario. I'm going to talk about why each approach to the show might or might not work, and decide on which one is the best. Starting with the first route. If the show reboots with the old cast, no matter how they go about it, there's going to be plenty of pros. Literally. Most obvious is that the original cast of The Office is just beloved by fans. Over a decade after the show ended, viewers have remained obsessed with the actors just as much as the characters they played. Their portrayals have become iconic, with fans continuing to replay their performances in the forms of GIFs years later. And it makes sense, as the cast has one of the most active relationships with their audience compared to any other show that's been on TV. Multiple of them have hosted podcasts about the show, and they even have their own dedicated section of Cameo. So it's not far-fetched to say that fans would be more than eager to watch a reboot about them. In fact, it's likely that viewers would be more invested in The Office than ever before, especially after hearing so many behind-the-scenes stories of how The Office changed the actors' lives. When it comes to the show itself, though, one of the most appealing parts about using the old cast would be seeing how they tackle new issues. A lot has changed since the original series ran, and so it would be interesting to see what the characters have to say. There's already been a visible appeal for this behind the many videos that have been made imagining how characters like Dwight would react to COVID, and I personally think it would be really funny to see Michael using ChatGPT. In addition to these new opportunities, the writers would also be able to learn from their mistakes. There have been a plethora of videos talking about the many twists and turns that the writers took during the later seasons of the show. To my memory, they mostly criticized the handling of characters like Andy, whose personality suffered from a lack of direction, as well as the show's struggle to find a replacement for Michael. If Steve Carell is in the returning cast, the problem of Michael's absence would be solved. But even if he doesn't return, the writers will know way more about what works and doesn't work with these characters, meaning that we could potentially have a much more consistently written out series. And with Greg Daniels being a confirmed showrunner, the cast will also have a much more familiar chemistry with him compared to if he worked with a new one. Daniels has a lot of experience with them, and so as a bonus, things would run just a bit more intuitively. Okay, so those are some of the overall pros of using the old cast that I could come up with, and they're pretty convincing. However, while all of these benefits do sound great, they quickly fall apart when you look at what the foundation of an Office with the old cast would have to be. Either it's 1, a continuation of the original story, 2, a remake of the story, or 3, an alternate universe. Starting off with the possibility of the show picking up where it left off, the sheer hype that would be generated from getting to see what happened to these characters would be huge. But at the same time, it would be one of the biggest problems with the show's writing. We already know what happened to these characters. All of their arcs were tied up in the series finale because there were no plans for a reboot. Even though there was a little bit of setup for Dwight's spin-off The Farm, that didn't happen, and likely never will. So if the show were to pick up where it left off, it would unravel everything that had already been wrapped up, starting conflicts and arcs that these characters just weren't written for. I mean, just look at the bad reception that the show got when it tried to shake up Pam and Jim's marriage. The writers needed more storylines, so they started doing all sorts of stuff, but fans were already satisfied with their marriage, so the plot twist just felt more weird than anything else. We've seen time and time again that digging a show or movie's characters out of the grave is universally hated. You need conflict for a story to happen, but no one wants to see nonsensical problems be given to happy characters. So for that reason, it's very possible that viewers would not receive a continuation well. But besides that, even if you are envisioning a continuation of The Office that manages to be interesting without starting new conflict, it would also just make no sense plot-wise. You'd have to get everyone back in the same office, for some reason working again under Michael, unless you had Michael working for Dwight, which I kind of have to admit that does sound like it would actually be pretty funny. But still, why is Kevin leaving his bar to work at Dunder Mifflin? Why is Oscar stepping down after being elected state senator? And why would Jim and Pam leave if they decided to pursue Jim's dream at Athlete? There's just no way they could ever realistically get everybody back in the same office again. But if you decide to continue the story outside of the office, or somehow gather them in a different location, the show instantly loses its namesake, The Office. And I know someone is probably commenting, why can't there just be a reboot centered around a particular character's life? if, but that wouldn't be a reboot of The Office since you'd be leaving out most of the cast. It would be more like a spin-off show about Stanley working a motorcycle flower store, which is definitely not already a shady Kickstarter. So now that I've thoroughly bludgeoned the idea of a continuation reboot, let's move on to the next possibility with using the old cast, the remake. So the remake would basically be the same show, but remastered with the old actors. This is definitely not going to happen, as it would just be the same show, but they look older. I would be really surprised if they chose to go this way. We would also already know everything that was going to happen, so that would kind of be boring. Although I can't lie, seeing the Chili event happen again like it's Kevin's canon event would be pretty hilarious. That leaves the only conclusion of rebooting the show with the old cast in an alternate universe. Basically, the show gets rebooted with the original cast, but changes details about the plot and their personal storylines. Maybe in this version, Pam and Jim's relationship plays out differently, or Kevin really does commit fraud. There are much more possibilities. And this is way better off than the continuation or remake in my opinion, just because it avoids all of their pitfalls. However, in my opinion, it's also just not the best choice. With the remake, if they retell the events of the first Office again, the audience will already know what happens. But if they change things up, audiences will be confused about why things are different. Why are Pam and Jim taking longer to get together? How come Michael isn't telling the same jokes? And again, I'm really sorry if anyone from the original cast is watching this, but why do they look old? I'm sorry, I promise you've all aged like wine. It's just what happens. So between this and the remake, you either get a low-key variant of the show, or you just remake the same plot again. It's messy and neither option works. Now I know this video has been a real Debbie Downer, but don't worry because I think the second route offers much better options. So let's get into the strategy that I much more prefer, a new cast. Just like with the old cast, the show could be rebooted as a remake, except this time with new actors interpreting the roles. It's essentially what Greg Daniels did with the UK version of The Office. However, surprise, I don't think this will work. At least compared to the best and final option that we'll be talking about. The main problem with this is really just the time frame. If The Office was made in the 80s, it would be different. There would be cause for a reboot because there would be a new generation to watch it. The show could reuse the same characters and plot, but have a fresh audience to retell the story to. Updating stuff like sound and video would give an actual reason to remake it, and the old cast wouldn't feel forgotten. That, however, is not the case. The ending and cast of The Office is still very fresh in people's minds. Just over 2 years ago, we got a never-before-seen cold open from Peacock, and The Office podcasts are some of the most listened to around the world. Remaking The Office right now with a new cast would feel like we were replacing the still very much beloved and relevant actors. How many people are gonna buy a shirt with new Dwight when old Dwight is still king? No, I'm not joking. Chris Pratt would be the best Dwight.
He's so cool.
While this is not a terrible option, I just don't think it's gonna happen. At least not this close to the original show's end. And that leaves us with the last, and in my opinion, the best option, new actors and a new story. I would be really disappointed if they don't decide to go with this type of reboot, because there are just way more pros here than any other option on the list. To lay it out for you, this reboot would reprise the main elements that made the original Office great, while also evolving it through new characters and plotlines. These character stories would be different, but would still be built on the core strengths of the original show. Awkwardness, pranks, and dry humor would still all be staples. With this type of reboot, there is infinitely more that the writers can do. You could still have the characters react to new societal changes like ChatGPT, but their new and modern character types would be able to complement them. There could be a crypto bro in The Office. Someone could start an OnlyFans. And although he wouldn't be the manager, I imagine if you had someone similar to Michael in charge, he would probably insist on The Office using the metaverse for meetings. A lot of people forget and never mention this, but a big part of the original Office was that it commentated on not just current issues, but also current pop culture. The whole Office watched Glee, react to parkour, and I think a lot of people don't realize that those were both new phenomenons at the time. Though it's not the main point of the story, it gets pretty cool thinking about the new cast having a watch party for Squid Game Season 2, or making references to whatever president is currently in office. I know a lot of people might be cringing at the examples I'm giving, but it's true to the show's spirit. Creed walked in on Halloween dressed up as the Dark Knight's Joker. I know it sounds vintage now, but that was actually new at the time. It's a very underrated part of the old show that I'd be happy to see if it was done right. The reboot could take place in Scranton, but I think a new branch or even new company would be much more interesting. It's been a surprisingly uncommon approach for shows to use the mockumentary format since The Office ended, but it would definitely also be used again. Abbott Elementary, a more recently successful show, proves that it still works great. Will we miss out on our actors playing their favorite roles again? Not really, because they could easily and much more gracefully come back as cameos or even side characters. Whether that be as a newly written character or already established ones for the first show, I can definitely see an episode where salespeople from the new cast have to try and sell paper to Jim at Athlete, or maybe Michael's just the CEO of Dunder Mifflin now. Maybe the new cast hangs out at Kevin's bar. There's just so many good possibilities about this one that it just swipes the other reboots off the board. I don't think this approach would just make the Office reboot work. I think it would be amazing. However, even if they do decide to go this route, there still is a major issue that we have to address. And that is that audiences just don't really like reboots. It's very common for fans of rebooted shows to not receive new characters well, or even worse, just ignore their existence altogether. Something about seeing new people occupy the space where your old favorites once stood is not exactly always like thrilling. I think the last time people actually cared about a reboot was Fuller House, with reboots like How I Met Your Mother and That 90s Show becoming instantly irrelevant past the release of their trailers. But I don't think it's necessarily the fault of the people producing the show. It's become incredibly difficult to watch stuff these days. Maybe even worse than cable. Every single NFL game is streamed in a different location. It's insanity. And likewise, reboots like these are often hidden and random streaming services nobody pays for. And that brings me to the very real issue of Peacock, where the show will no doubt be housed. While the reboot of The Office getting placed on Peacock will no doubt increase the service's numbers, it's still gonna hold this reboot back just like it's holding back the original Office right now. No one wants to be on this streaming service. It's been around, it's had time, and the majority of people just have not been sold on it. I think this is directly why The Office saw its second decline after the revival of its fan base about 6 years ago. You see, 6 years ago, rewatching The Office was a sensation. Everyone was hopping on Netflix to binge the show, some people watching it for the first time. Because Netflix was such a mainstream service, everyone was able to watch it at the same time, making the show very popular. Suddenly, you had all the actors being interviewed about The Office on late night shows, even though the show had been over years ago. I mean, there was literally a song by a real band called AJR specifically about rewatching The Office on Netflix. Now, given AJR is not a good band, but still, Billie Eilish was playing the Office theme song before her shows, and even sampled it in a song. People loved revisiting it, and most of the hype is still around today. But with its move to Peacock, a much less popular streaming service, the show's renaissance has come to a stiff halt. And you can see this in the way that public discourse about the show has changed. I mean, just a couple years ago, it seemed like everyone was obsessed with The Office. But now, many of those sentiments have turned into this weird bitterness. You see, when you don't watch a show for a couple of years, but still hear everyone talking about how great it is, you start to forget why you liked it. So while The Office still has an abundance of diehard fans, there's also just a new crowd of people saying that it's overrated and that like Pam and Jim are toxic, a bunch of edgy takes deconstructing the show. And I really think it's because no one's been watching it since it came out on Peacock, which is changing the way that it's remembered. It's also probably the reason why these rewatch podcasts did so good. I mean, the commentary is obviously the main appeal, but it's definitely the new way that people rewatch the show now that it's not on Netflix. And honestly, I fear for what will happen to Breaking Bad if it gets imprisoned by AMC Plus or whatever. As for Steve Carell's comments about the show's humor not working in modern times, I've purposely chosen to leave that argument out of the video, just because I feel like talking about that would be a weird subject to dance around. I don't really know if The Office would be too offensive to air today, but I prefer not to talk about it because I really have no idea. If they go with this last approach, I think The Office reboot can definitely work, specifically with that idea of a new cast and a new story. While it might seem impossible with the lack of success that other show reboots and spin-offs get, I've chosen to be pretty optimistic with this one just because of the people involved. There's plenty of original cast members that said that they're willing to get back on the show, and many of them were original writers. Greg Daniels is of course the original creator of The Office, and he seems intent on doing this right. So hopefully he'll make the right decision about what this show is going to be. And hopefully Peacock will explode. Regardless of what logical fallacies I find in the other reboots, if The Office manages to evolve while keeping what made it great, I think it would be considered a success. But what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments if you think that The Office reboot can work, and how you would go about writing it. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. I'm Lufa.